Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I revisit the original Olympus Pen, which was first introduced in 1959 and was an immediate success. The camera was one of the smallest cameras available at the time, and the reason for that is that it was basically designed around shooting just half a frame. So it was a half frame camera designed to shoot by default a vertical oriented half frame of a 35mm full frame and only expose that, and naturally that also means that out of a traditional 36 exposure roll you get 72 frames because you're just exposing half a frame with each shot. So it was quite economical. Looking at the camera itself, you think, okay, what are the features here? Because there are no advanced features. It doesn't have a built-in light meter, there's no rangefinder, there are obviously also no batteries. So what you have is a viewfinder camera with relatively limited shutter speeds, and that's it. So it really is a camera that forces you to think with each shot that you're taking. What is the distance to my subject, and kind of make an educated guess and then set that. What is the correct exposure, and knowing the correct exposure, also using the limitations of the available aperture and shutter speeds to set it correctly, and all this kind of thinking that basically goes into each and every shot. And to make the camera even more interesting, it does have historical significance, because it was the very first creation of Yoshihisa Maitani, who became one of the most important camera designers next to Oscar Barnack in the 20th century, and became really a legend, especially when we look at the Olympus camera creations. He's not just responsible for this original Olympus Pen, which was really his first creation as a camera, but also the slightly later Olympus Pen F, which was a single lens reflex half frame camera, which we have reviewed on the channel before. Then in the 1970s, the Olympus OM series, and here we have reviewed the OM1 and OM4 Ti here on the channel. And then later on in the 1980s, the Olympus XA, and he was responsible for all these different camera designs. So as you can hear, a really interesting camera, and many reasons to take a closer look at it and review it properly as usual. The story behind this camera is really unique and remarkable. Something like this only comes around once in a while. We go all the way back to 1954, when Yoshihisa Maitani was a student at Waseda University. And on the side, he was a very passionate photographer. And interestingly, he had access to his family's Leica 3F, which he could borrow on a regular basis and use to take his photographs. And that is interesting because at the time this camera was really expensive. It cost 200,000 yen back then, which was already expensive in US dollars as well, so 550 US dollars back then, which would translate to around 5,000 US dollars today. So quite an expensive camera, and he had access to it and could use it on a regular basis. And the insight that he received of how should a camera work and be and so forth also led him to create his own camera design, a rangefinder design that he not just created but also patented. So he had a patent going on as a 21-year-old or something. And on the other side we have Olympus, a pretty young Japanese camera manufacturer at the time, and they were actively looking for talent. They wanted to grow, they wanted to build expertise. And Aichi Sakurai, who was the head of the Olympus camera division, was also scouting for talent and kind of stumbled upon, more or less by accident, the patent by Maitani. And he immediately saw the quality in it and reached personally out to Maitani and basically encouraged him to join the company. And he did. He left his chosen career as an automotive engineer behind, and apparently he even had a job offer at the time, and kind of disregarded that in order to go to Olympus and start a career there. And then something interesting happens because he's not just immediately designing cameras, but instead he had 2 years of practical training where he basically moved from different departments in 6 months intervals to get a better understanding of how the production works. So he got a closer look at the manufacturing and production departments, for instance, before returning to the actual design division and receiving a very simple task: try designing something. Was basically the briefing. And my understanding then is that he then set himself that goal of creating a rather inexpensive camera, and he set out to do something incredible because he thought, okay, how about there would be a Olympus consumer camera that would be available for just 6,000 yen. And that was really unheard of at the time, because the cheapest camera in the Olympus lineup back then was 23,000 yen. And just to give you dimensions again, this would translate to, I think it was $16 at the time, which would still only be $140 today. And that would be the 6,000 yen camera that he wanted to create. So a really, really inexpensive camera in comparison, especially to the Leica 3F that he had access to at home. And yet Maitani set out to tackle that challenge, but he also understood, okay, one of the most important aspects of a camera is the lens, and he apparently believed strongly that the lens is the soul of the camera. And because of that, allegedly he spent most of its budget, most of the budget that he had, together with the optical department, really challenging the optical division in the process, because he wanted to have a Tessar type lens design, so really high quality design that would ensure that the lens quality would be really good for this camera despite its relatively cheap price. So he spent most of his money on the lens in the first place. And then after receiving additional budget, he went through 5 prototypes. And the final prototype, when he showed it to his superior, his senior manager at Olympus at the time, they immediately decided, okay, to go into production with it. And then something interesting happens, because the first production run that started in October 1959 was not done by Olympus, but it was outsourced to a subcontractor, to Sanko's Shoji. And only when sales really soared and Olympus could see, okay, this is selling pretty good, after 30,000 cameras were produced. I think in May 1960, Olympus decided, okay, let's take the production in-house, and did that. So there is a second production run, and here you can see a difference already between the production. So if you're in the market for such a camera, it's always interesting to look out for the little differences between the production runs. And here the very first one has flash written in red letters around the lens, and the second production run does not have that anymore. And then there's a third production run later on, and this is the version also that I have here, which I think started in 1962 and ran until 1964. And this one here is the only one that has 2 lugs, so to speak. So it just let's say not just attach a hand strap like the first one that just had 1 lug on one side, but you have basically 2 lugs, and that also enables you to put a neck strap around it if you want to. Arguably, Maitani's decision to make it a half-frame camera started a half-frame craze that lasted well into the 1980s. And that is really interesting here, because of course there were economical advantages. But looking at it from a historical perspective, that idea of a half-frame camera was nothing new. It was already out there, and Leica, for instance, had produced the so-called, so Lights at the time as a company had produced the Leica 72 cameras, which were especially interesting in the movie production setup, where this is also the format that is traditionally shot from a movie camera, so just half a frame and then a lot of them in consecutive shooting. And for test shots, this of course is also interesting to just shoot exactly that particular format then. And so Leitz had such a camera in very limited numbers, basically based on their screw mount range finders. And very interestingly, if you dig deeper, there was almost a moment in history where Leica had produced the so-called Leica H, which was also a half-frame camera and that could have potentially gone into production in 1960, and that was created by Adam Wagner. So Adam Wagner designed this particular camera for Leica, but unfortunately it was never produced because of a lack of production capacity on the Leica side. So while Olympus decided to outsource this little camera, this little test run, to somebody else, with great quality, by the way, Leitz decided not to produce it, and interestingly, Adam Wagner resigned afterwards. After 32 years of working for Leitz, he resigned afterwards because he was so upset about the fact that the camera was not being produced. And looking at that from today's perspective, I was wondering, okay, how different could history have looked like if Leitz had decided to produce this camera and also bring it to the market in 1960, basically shortly after Olympus had released its very successful Olympus Pen at the time. We will never know. So what about the features of this camera, and also what about the lens? As mentioned before, Maitani made sure that this rather small and inexpensive camera would come with an excellent and sharp lens. So he settled for a Tessar type triplet design for the lens, and it is a 28mm f3.5. The 28mm focal length is more or less a standard focal length for half-frame cameras, and it is roughly equivalent to a 40 or 42mm focal length on a full-frame camera. The lens barely protrudes from the camera itself, so it is really easy to pocket the camera, and the whole idea of the camera is to use it more or less like a pen, to be able to just put it into your pocket of a coat or a sports coat, a sports jacket, whatever you have, and just put it in there, slip it in there, just like you would with a pen. And if you see here, just for visual comparison, the size of a pen and then this camera, it is really incredibly small, and yet the handling is awesome. The lens features a focusing ring which wonderfully snaps into place for the marked distances, but you can of course also focus on the distances in between. And the lens allows for close focusing down to 2 feet, which is really, really impressive, and also gives you wonderful results and a wonderful bokeh as well. The filter thread here is 22.5mm, so pretty small, and the smallest aperture is 22, so you go all the way from 3.5 to 22 with respect to your aperture settings. And with respect to the shutter speed settings, which are also located around the lens, you're fairly limited to 5 options. It's basically 1/200th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/50th of a second, and 1/25th of a second, plus a bulb mode. And what I personally find very interesting, because of the nature of the shutter and the nature of this camera, you can confidently shoot at 1/25th of a second. It's not too slow, and you don't have to fear any kind of camera shake because of this beautiful, silent, stable shutter and camera. The Olympus Pen also features a cold flash shoe on top, a PC connection here on the front, a tripod socket on the bottom and a cable release here on the top. And besides that, on the top plate, there's basically the shutter release button, a beautifully designed frame counter, and the film rewind lever, and that's it. That's the entire camera. The viewfinder appears rather small at first, but works wonderfully and also has a lens built in. And the frame lines give you an indication for the correct framing depending on whether you close focus here, then you have one of the frames counting, and or whether you focus to infinity. Depending on that, you have to choose the right one, and in between you have to kind of make an educated guess, so there's no parallax compensation for these frame lines. A beautiful detail visually are, and not just visually, but also in terms of the camera design, are the little feet of the camera, which ensure that the bottom plate is protected from any kind of scratches when you put it down. And this is the kind of feature that is simply beautiful and that kind of got lost in many cameras that you can purchase today, or sometimes they are made out of rubber or something that is not as beautiful as these little feet that are part of the entire the body of the camera. So what are my personal impressions? As you could probably tell, I just fell in love with this camera and its beautiful history. It was also love at first sight because of its fantastic minimalist design. For me, this is a product design masterpiece. And unfortunately, at least in my opinion, the later versions of the Olympus Pen series are, for me, always a visual compromise to some extent, because they need to integrate a new feature or a more advanced feature, and that results in something that does not look as good anymore as it did in the original version. So for me, the first version is the most refined one, and I could see how much thought and love went into the prototypes and then into the production of this camera. What I also really appreciate is that it does not have any kind of rangefinder or built-in light meter. So for me, this is the kind of camera that creates a sense of hyper-awareness when I'm out on the street with it, because I have to constantly think about the distances to my subjects, basically make guesstimations, educated guesses, and it also encourages me to constantly be aware of the light and how the correct exposure would be. So I'm constantly thinking about, okay, a sunny 16 rule, and okay, now I'm leaving the shade, moving into the light. This is a darker situation here, so I change my shutter speed accordingly. And this happens kind of all the time, and I really like that about each and every mechanical camera out there, and I've mentioned that before. But for this particular one, due to the limitations that it comes with, and even the limitation that I also have to estimate the distances, I just like how much it creates that sense of awareness and being in the moment and being just a photographer floating around on the street and taking these kind of shots. And it's even more fun to then see if the shots come out right. What I also like is that I have 72 shots per roll, and not so much because of the economical factor, that it is nice, but more because it lets me sometimes shoot a third or fourth shot of the very same scene and situation without really thinking hard about it. So I just take the additional shots, and sometimes I create images that are better or even perfect because of that. I get that decisive moments sometimes that I would not have gotten if I had just taken that one shot that I sometimes do when I shoot full frame 35mm. And maybe this is something that I should change in general, but here I just feel with this camera that I can be more generous when taking shots. What I also like is a really small feature, but that I basically have to set the frame counter manually to 72 in the beginning. And I learned during my research that Maitani saved around 40 parts just on that particular feature that you have to manually reset the film counter. And I love that. I love that, to say, okay, I want to make a consumer-friendly, small and inexpensive camera, so I just leave out the parts, and it's up to the consumer to set the right frame number, depending on the roll of film that they have in there, and then you kind of count down. And this is so lovely that with each shot you take, you see, okay, it's more like a countdown instead of the other way around as it usually happens, that you shoot upwards. And last but not least, I can see myself using this camera also for portrait sessions, because at first I was really concerned about the half frame negative and kind of thinking, okay, the quality would not be good enough, but seeing the scans and seeing the kind of quality of the negatives because of the lens and its sharpness and contrast and all that, I really am confident by now to shoot with this camera and to get the kind of quality that I want. And because of the character of the lens and the 3D pop it creates, I could even see myself using it in a portrait session. I've experimented a little bit with it because I was so curious to see how it would work. And again, here you have the same advantage as shooting portraits. You can just shoot a lot of frames right after each other, and using your thumb here just to get to the next frame is also very easy and nice. So here, great lens, great 3D pop, and overall I can just say, okay, this is a great camera. It's well suited for street photography, and it's well suited for traveling because you can simply pocket it and have a beautiful compact travel camera that comes, at least for me, with a sense of hyper awareness when shooting it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat different review of the original Olympus Pen. If you did, please remember to like this video and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.